The evening was set to be a grand one, as it had been for the last 26 years. Each year, Albert and Jessica hosted their annual dinner party, a celebration of their marriage, their family, and the life they had built together. The house was bustling with the sounds of laughter and conversation. The smell of roasted meats and freshly baked bread filled the air, mingling with the crisp scent of Jessica's favorite flowers that adorned the dining table. Albert stood by the fireplace, watching his guests move around the room, chatting and laughing. He felt a sense of satisfaction as he saw how well everything had come together. Hosting this party was always a point of pride for him, a way to showcase the life he and Jessica had built. He looked across the room and saw her standing with a group of friends, her head thrown back in laughter. She was wearing the black mini dress he loved, the one that fit her perfectly, showing just enough skin to be alluring without being overt. As Albert watched her, he felt a familiar pang of affection. Even after all these years, Jessica still had a way of catching his eye. He remembered their wedding day, the way she had looked walking down the aisle, and how he had felt like the luckiest man alive. That feeling hadn't faded over the years, despite the ups and downs they had faced. But tonight, something felt different. As he watched Jessica, a sense of unease began to creep in. It was subtle at first, just a faint tug at the back of his mind, but it grew stronger as the evening went on. He tried to shake it off, convincing himself that it was nothing more than the usual stress of hosting a large gathering. "Albert, this is marvelous," said Kent, one of their oldest friends, as he approached with a drink in hand. "You've really outdone yourself this year." "Thank you, Kent," Albert replied, forcing a smile. "It's always a pleasure to have everyone together." But even as he spoke, his mind was elsewhere. He couldn't help but notice the way Jessica and his younger brother, Frank, were interacting. Frank had arrived late, as usual, but had quickly made himself at home. Albert had always been close with his brother, despite the 6-year age gap and Frank's tendency to get himself into trouble. Since Frank's recent divorce, he had been more withdrawn, but tonight, he seemed almost too cheerful. Albert had been glad to see Frank smiling again, but something about his demeanor felt off. He watched as Frank moved through the room, always seeming to gravitate back towards Jessica. The two of them had always been friendly, but tonight there was a different energy between them. It wasn't anything overt, just small things, an inside joke that no one else was privy to, a shared glance that lasted a moment too long. "Excuse me for a moment," Jessica said, placing a hand on Albert's arm as she passed him. "I need to check on something in the kitchen." Albert nodded, watching as she walked away. A few minutes later, he noticed Frank slipping out of the room as well, offering a vague excuse about needing to help Jessica with something. A cold knot of anxiety formed in Albert's stomach. He tried to ignore it, telling himself that he was overreacting. But the nagging feeling wouldn't go away. The laughter and chatter of the party seemed to fade into the background as his mind raced with possibilities. He considered following them immediately but hesitated, unsure if he was ready to confront whatever he might find. Instead, he waited, his eyes flicking between the doorway and the guests who were still enjoying the evening, oblivious to his growing unease. The seconds ticked by slowly, each one feeling like an eternity. Finally, he couldn't take it anymore. He excused himself from the conversation he was pretending to participate in and headed towards the kitchen. As he walked through the house, his footsteps echoed in his ears, loud and ominous. The closer he got to the kitchen, the more his heart pounded in his chest. He paused outside the door, hearing muffled voices from within. One was Jessica's, her tone was playful, a side of her he hadn't heard in a long time. The other voice was Frank's, low and conspiratorial. Albert's breath caught in his throat. He pushed the door open slowly, not wanting to startle them, but needing to see what was happening. The scene that greeted him was like something out of a nightmare. Jessica was sitting on the edge of the kitchen counter, her legs wrapped tightly around Frank's waist. He was standing between her legs, his hands under her dress, moving with a familiarity that made Albert feel sick. Jessica's face was one he barely recognized, a mix of raw passion and lust that she had never shown him. Their faces inches apart. Jessica's expression was one of pure pleasure, her eyes half closed, her lips parted. Frank was grinning, whispering something in her ear that made her giggle softly. Albert felt as if the floor had dropped out from under him. His chest tightened, and for a moment, he couldn't breathe. His mind struggled to make sense of what he was seeing, but there was no denying it. They were having an affair, right there in his own home, during their anniversary party. "What the fuck, Jessica?" Albert whispered, his voice barely audible. The words slipped out before he could even process what he was seeing. Jessica's eyes snapped open, locking with his. For a brief moment, it was as if time had frozen. The look of pleasure on her face instantly shifted to horror as she realized they were caught. Her eyes widened, and her jaw dropped. She looked like she was trying to wake up from a bad dream, hoping that if she blinked enough, the nightmare would disappear. But the nightmare was real. Frank, sensing the change in Jessica, slowly turned his head to see what had caused it. When he saw Albert standing in the doorway, his reaction was different. There was no panic, no regret. Instead, a smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth, a smug, satisfied look that made Albert blood boil. "You stuck your fingers deep into her, didn't you?" Albert said, his voice cold and cutting through the silence like a knife. "Seems like you really got her going, huh?" The words hung in the air, heavy and damning. Jessica's face crumpled, and she quickly pushed Frank away, stumbling as she tried to fix her dress. Her hands were trembling so badly she could barely zip it up. She looked at Albert, her eyes pleading, but she couldn't find the words to explain. What was there to say? The evidence of her betrayal was right there, undeniable and raw. Frank, on the other hand, took a step back, his smirk fading as the weight of the situation began to sink in. The bravado he had shown just moments before began to crack, and for the first time, he looked uncertain. Albert stood there, feeling a whirlwind of emotions he couldn't quite process. Anger, betrayal, and sadness all hit him at once. But something else settled over him as well, a cold, calculated calmness. He had always prided himself on being level-headed, on keeping his composure in difficult situations. This, however, was beyond anything he had ever faced. And yet, in that moment, he knew exactly what he had to do. "Albert, please," Jessica finally managed to choke out, stepping towards him. Her voice was desperate, but she kept glancing at Frank, as if hoping he would say something to make it all better. This isn't what it looks like." Albert's eyes narrowed, and he let out a bitter laugh. "Isn't what it looks like? Jessica, I don't think there's any other way to interpret this." Jessica flinched at the coldness in his voice, but she pressed on, her voice trembling. I didn't mean for this to happen. It just happened. It was a mistake, Albert, a horrible mistake." "A mistake?" Albert repeated, his voice rising. "A mistake is forgetting to pick up the dry cleaning, Jessica. This is a betrayal." Frank cleared his throat, finally finding his voice. "Albert, man, shut the fuck up, Frank," Albert snapped, cutting him off. "I don't want to hear a damn thing from you." Frank's mouth closed, and he took another step back, raising his hands as if in surrender. The smugness was completely gone now, replaced by a mix of fear and shame. Albert could see the wheels turning in his brother's head, trying to figure out how to get out of this mess. Jessica reached out to touch Albert's arm, but he recoiled as if she had burned him. "Don't," he said sharply. "Don't touch me, you slut." Tears welled up in Jessica's eyes, and she quickly wiped them away with the back of her hand. "Please, Albert, we can talk about this. We can work through it. I still love you. I never stopped loving you." Albert stared at her, feeling a strange disconnect between her words and the actions he had just witnessed. "You love me?" he asked, his voice thick with disbelief. "Is that what you call this? Love?" "Albert, it wasn't like that," Jessica insisted, her voice breaking. "I don't even know how it started. I was lonely, and Frank was there, and—" Albert slapped her through the face. "Stop, bitch," he said, holding up a hand. "Just stop. Don't try to justify this. There's nothing you can say that will make this right." Jessica opened her mouth to protest, but the look on Albert's face silenced her. She had never seen him like this before, so cold, so distant. It was as if the man she had known for over 2 decades was gone, replaced by someone she didn't recognize. The party outside continued, the laughter and music filtering into the kitchen like a cruel reminder of the life Albert had thought he was living. He could hear the clinking of glasses, the murmur of conversations, but it all seemed so far away, so meaningless now. The image of Jessica and Frank locked in their betrayal was burned into his mind, and no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't push it away. Jessica took a tentative step toward him, her eyes filled with tears. "Albert, please, I can explain." Albert turned to face her, his expression cold and unreadable. "Explain?" he repeated, his voice eerily calm. "What exactly is there to explain, Jessica? You and my brother, in our home, during our anniversary party?" Jessica's lip quivered, and she seemed to be searching for the right words, but nothing she could say would make a difference. Albert had given her everything, his love, his loyalty, his trust, and she had thrown it all away. And Frank, his own brother, had stabbed him in the back in the worst way imaginable. "Albert the First," Frank began, his voice faltering as he stepped forward. Albert cut him off with a sharp look, his eyes flashing with fury. "Don't," he hissed, the word laced with venom. "You don't get to speak. Not after what you've done." Frank froze, his mouth snapping shut. He had always been the reckless one, the one who couldn't hold down a relationship, who always seemed to find himself in trouble. Albert had bailed him out more times than he could count, but this was beyond forgiveness. This was personal. "You're dead to me," Albert said, his voice low and dangerous. "Both of you." The words hung in the air like a death sentence, and for a moment, neither Jessica nor Frank moved. Albert could see the shock in their eyes, the realization that there was no going back, that the damage was done and irreversible. For a moment, the three of them stood there in silence, the reality of the situation settling over them like a dark cloud. Albert could feel his heart pounding in his chest, each beat echoing in his ears like a drum. He wanted to scream, to lash out, to do something to release the rage that was building inside him, but he held it back. He wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing him break. Instead, he took a deep breath and looked at them both, his gaze steady and unyielding. "Here's what's going to happen," he said, his voice calm and controlled. "You're both going to leave this house. Now. And don't bother coming back. I don't want to see either of you ever again." Jessica's eyes widened in shock. "Albert, you don't mean that." "We can." "I do mean it," Albert interrupted, his tone leaving no room for argument. "We're done, Jessica. You made your choice, and now you have to live with it." Frank hesitated, glancing between Albert and Jessica, as if looking for some way to defuse the situation. But Albert didn't give him the chance. "Get out," he said again, his voice hard as steel. "Both of you." Jessica looked like she wanted to say something more, but the look in Albert's eyes stopped her. She nodded slowly, tears streaming down her face, and turned to leave the kitchen. Frank followed, his head hung low, his steps heavy with the weight of what he had done. Albert watched them go, his heart a mix of rage and sorrow. When the door finally closed behind them, he let out a long, shaky breath, leaning heavily against the counter. His world had just fallen apart, but he knew he couldn't afford to crumble. Not yet. There would be time to grieve later. For now, he needed to focus. There were things that needed to be done, decisions to be made. The life he had known was over, and it was up to him to figure out what came next. He needed to get out of there, to think, to plan. The party was already over from this drama, and made his way upstairs to his study, the only place in the house where he felt he could be alone. Once inside, he closed the door behind him and leaned against it, letting out a long, shaky breath. The study was his sanctuary, a place where he could escape the pressures of work, of life. The walls were lined with shelves filled with books, and a large mahogany desk sat in the center of the room, papers neatly stacked on top. But tonight, the room felt different, claustrophobic, oppressive. This betrayal wouldn't go unpunished. He had always prided himself on being a fair man. But this required something more, something that would make them both regret what they had done. He sat down at his desk and opened his laptop, the glow of the screen illuminating his face. He began typing, his fingers moving quickly across the keys. He knew what he had to do. First, he would deal with Jessica. Their life together was over, and there would be no reconciliation, no forgiveness. He would file for divorce immediately, citing her infidelity, but that wasn't enough. Jessica had always been concerned with appearances, with maintaining the image of the perfect wife and mother. He would destroy that image, make sure everyone knew the truth about what she had done. He would make it public. He had enough connections in the media to ensure that the story would spread more like wildfire. Jessica, already become a pariah, shunned by their social circle, her reputation in tatters. The thought of her having to face the people she had deceived, to see the judgment in their eyes, gave him a grim sense of satisfaction. Next, he turned his attention to Frank. His brother had always relied on him, had always assumed that Albert would be there to pick up the pieces when he inevitably screwed up. But not this time. Albert would cut him off completely, severing all financial and familial ties. Frank had already lost everything in his divorce. Now, he would lose whatever support he had left. But that wasn't enough either. Albert needed to hit him where it hurt. Frank had been planning to start a new business venture, something he had been talking about for months. Albert had initially agreed to help fund it, but now, that plan was off the table. Instead, he would make sure that every door was closed to Frank, that every potential investor turned him down. Albert had enough influence in the right circles to make that happen. He would make sure Frank had no choice but to leave, to flee the country in search of a fresh start where no one knew his name. But no matter where he went, he would always carry the weight of his betrayal, knowing that he had lost everything because of one reckless decision. As he finalized his plans, a sense of calm settled over Albert. He had always believed in justice, in the idea that actions had consequences. Now, he would be the one to deliver those consequences, to make sure that Jessica and Frank paid the price for what they had done. He closed his laptop and sat back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. The party was still going on downstairs, but he had no desire to return to it. The life he had known was over, and now, all that was left was to ensure that those who had betrayed him suffered the consequences. Albert stood up, feeling a cold determination settle over him. There was still much to do, but he was ready. The plan was set, and there was no turning back. Jessica and Frank had made their choice, and now, they would face the consequences of their actions. The days that followed were a whirlwind of decisive, unforgiving actions. Albert moved swiftly, his heart hardened by the betrayal he had witnessed. The first step was to sever ties with Jessica completely. He contacted his lawyer, a no-nonsense man who had handled the family's legal affairs for years. Within hours, the wheels were in motion for a divorce that would leave Jessica with nothing. Jessica tried to reach him, pleading for a chance to explain, to make things right. She called him, texted him, even showed up at his office, but Albert refused to see her. Each time he saw her name flash on his phone, he felt a fresh wave of disgust. He didn't want to hear her voice, didn't want to be swayed by any remnants of the love he had once felt. That love was dead, replaced by a cold, burning desire to make her pay for what she had done. The hardest part was telling their children. They don't know anything yet. This would be easy if they came to the dinner on that day. Michael and Stella had always seen their parents as the ideal couple, a beacon of stability and love in their lives. When Albert sat them down and told them the truth, the shock was palpable. Michael, 24 years old and the spitting image of his father, was the first to react. His face, usually calm and composed, twisted in disbelief. "Dad, are you sure?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Mom, with Uncle Frank? It doesn't make sense." "It's true," Albert replied, his voice steady but cold. "I caught them myself." Stella, younger by 3 years and always more emotionally expressive, burst into tears. "How could she?" she cried, her hands trembling as she covered her face. "How could she do this to you, to us?" Albert had no comforting words to offer. He had always been a man of action, not of sentiment, and now more than ever, he couldn't afford to be soft. "I'm filing for divorce," he said firmly. "Your mother made her choice, and now she has to live with it." The reality of the situation hit Stella hard. Her tears dried up, replaced by a simmering anger that she directed at Jessica. That evening, when Jessica came to the house to try and talk to Albert, Stella confronted her in the hallway. "How could you do this to Dad?" Stella spat, her voice shaking with rage. "How could you betray him like that? Like, like some cheap whore?" Jessica's face crumpled, her eyes filling with tears, but Stella was relentless. "Do you even care what you've done to this family? You've destroyed everything." "I'm so sorry, Stella," Jessica sobbed, reaching out to touch her daughter's arm, but Stella recoiled as if burned. "Don't touch me," Stella snapped. "You're nothing to me now." Michael, who had been standing silently by, stepped forward. He had always been the one to keep his emotions in check, but now his voice was as cold as his father's. "I don't ever want to see you again," he said, his words cutting through the air like a blade. "You're dead to me." Jessica stood there, shattered, as her children turned their backs on her. She wanted to explain, to somehow make them understand that it hadn't meant anything, that she had made a terrible mistake. But how could she? The truth was too ugly, too shameful. Albert watched from a distance, his heart a mix of satisfaction and sadness. This was the consequence of her actions. Jessica had destroyed their family, and now she was paying the price. The divorce was finalized quickly. Albert made sure of that. Jessica was left with nothing. He took the house, the savings, and even the car. Jessica, who had once lived a life of comfort and luxury, was forced to move into a small, dingy apartment on the other side of town. It was all she could afford with the little she had managed to save over the years. The humiliation was unbearable, but she had no one to blame but herself. As for Frank, the fallout was just as devastating. The news of his betrayal spread through their social circle like wildfire. Friends and acquaintances, people who had once admired him, now shunned him. He became a pariah, the whispers and glances following him wherever he went. Unable to bear the constant judgment and shame, Frank made a decision. He packed up what little he had left and fled the country, leaving behind the mess he had created. He didn't tell anyone where he was going, not even his closest friends. He just disappeared, hoping to start anew in a place where no one knew his name, where he could escape the consequences of his actions. But Albert knew that no matter where Frank went, the guilt would follow him. The knowledge that he had destroyed his brother's life, shattered his family, and lost everything would haunt him for the rest of his days. The fallout was complete. Albert had taken everything from them, his wife, his brother. They had destroyed the life he had known, and in return, he had destroyed theirs. But as he stood in the empty house, the echoes of the past reverberating in the silence, he couldn't shake the feeling that something inside him had been lost as well. The revenge had been satisfying, but it was also hollow. The life he had built, the family he had cherished, was gone, and no amount of retribution could bring it back. Albert was left alone, victorious in his quest for justice, but with nothing to show for it except the cold, empty shell of a man who had lost everything he held dear. In the months that followed, Albert threw himself into his role as a father. He attended every one of Michael's business presentations, offering advice and guidance as his son navigated the early stages of his career. He made a point of visiting Stella at college, taking her out to dinner, and listening to her talk about her studies and her plans for the future. The bond with his children grew stronger, fortified by the shared pain of betrayal. But there was an unspoken tension between them, a shadow that hung over their interactions. Michael and Stella were still grappling with the fallout, struggling to reconcile the image of their mother with the reality of what she had done. They tried to move forward, but the past was a constant presence, lurking in the background of every conversation. One evening, as the three of them sat around the dinner table in the now quiet house, the conversation turned to Jessica. "Have you heard from Mom?" Stella asked, her voice hesitant. Albert shook his head. "No. She hasn't tried to reach out since the divorce was finalized." Michael leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "I heard she's living in some tiny apartment across town. Must be rough after the life she had." "Good," Stella muttered, stabbing at her food with her fork. "She deserves it." Albert watched his daughter, noting the bitterness in her tone. He knew that Stella was still angry, still hurt by the betrayal. She had been closer to Jessica than Michael had, and the wound was deeper for her. She made her choices, Albert said quietly. And now she has to live with the consequences. Michael nodded in agreement, but there was a sadness in his eyes that Albert recognized. It was the same sadness he saw when he looked in the mirror, a reflection of the loss they had all suffered. The family they had known was gone, torn apart by Jessica's actions, and nothing would ever be the same again. After dinner, Michael and Stella said their goodbyes and headed back to their respective lives. Albert stood at the door, watching them drive away, the weight of the empty house pressing down on him. He had his children, but he was still alone. The quiet was deafening, a constant reminder of what he had lost. He wandered through the house, each room filled with memories of the life he had once shared with Jessica. The kitchen, where they had cooked countless meals together. The living room, where they had spent cozy nights in front of the fireplace. The bedroom, where they had shared both their happiest and most intimate moments. But those memories were tainted now, overshadowed by the image of Jessica and Frank in that same kitchen, entwined in their betrayal. Albert stopped in front of the large family portrait that hung in the hallway. It had been taken a few years ago, during happier times. They were all smiling, unaware of the storm that was brewing just beneath the surface. He stared at Jessica's face, trying to reconcile the woman in the photograph with the one who had torn his life apart. He felt a surge of anger, followed by a wave of sadness. He had loved her once, more than he had ever loved anyone. They had built a life together, raised two wonderful children, and shared dreams of growing old side by side. But all of that was gone now, shattered by her infidelity. Albert turned away from the portrait and walked into his study, the one place in the house where he felt a semblance of peace. He sat down at his desk, the familiar smell of leather and old books filling the air. He opened his laptop and stared at the screen, but his mind was elsewhere. He stood up from his desk and walked to the window, looking out at the city lights below. The world outside continued to move, oblivious to the turmoil in his heart. Albert knew he had a long road ahead, a journey of healing and self-discovery. But for now, all he could do was take it one day at a time, slowly piecing together the fragments of his life.